The Ruth Wilson case begins with a damp road on Box Hill, and tonight you have the file open beside a small lamp, listening to rain soften against the glass. There's no hurry here, because this is the kind of case that asks to be read slowly. You begin on the 27th of November, 1995, with the paper feeling thin under your fingertips and the first page carrying the ordinary details of a Monday. Ruth was 16, from Betchworth near Dorking in Surrey, and by late afternoon she had taken a taxi up toward Box Hill. You can imagine the driver's cab smelling faintly of vinyl seats and wet wool, the heater murmuring, the windscreen wipers moving back and forth in a steady rhythm. The Ruth Wilson case has never rested easily, not because it shouts, but because so much of it is quiet. A school day was missed, a town library was visited, flowers were ordered from a shop on Dorking High Street, a taxi carried a girl toward a place she already knew, and then, after the fare was paid and the car moved away, the trail softened in the rain. You turn the first page carefully. It is not a page of certainty. It is a page of errands, sightings, remembered tones of voice, and small human choices that investigators would come back to for years. In this file, the ordinary matters. The time of a taxi call matters. The smell of a florist's shop matters. The fact that Ruth stood still for a moment in the weather, instead of walking away at once, matters because someone remembered it. To investigate the Ruth Wilson case was to begin with restraint. Surrey police were not handed a clear answer. They were handed a missing teenager, a landscape of paths and quarry edges and winter trees, and a family who could not make the evening settle into anything normal. You can almost hear the first telephone calls, low and practical, voices trying to stay even while clocks moved on. At home, Ruth had not returned. At school, it became clear she had not attended that day. The file begins to gather weight there, because every missing person inquiry has a moment when ordinary lateness becomes something else. You can picture a kitchen light on after dark, the air still holding the smell of tea or supper, and someone checking again what they already know. The first task was simple in words and difficult in practice. Find where Ruth had gone, confirm who saw her, build the day back from fragments. When you read a case like this by lamplight, you notice how patient that work has to be. A detective does not begin with a theory and make the facts obey it. A careful detective begins with the last reliable sighting, then walks backward, step by step. Ruth's last confirmed sighting was near Box Hill, after a taxi journey from Dorking railway station. The driver said she was dropped near a bridleway, not far from the Hand in Hand pub, as it was then known. You pause over that detail, because names of places can change while files remain the same. The pub later became the Box Tree, but in the paperwork of that day, the older name stays like ink pressed into paper. It was late November, and the weather mattered. Ruth was wearing a red knitted jumper, black velvet trousers, and black pixie boots. She did not have the kind of heavy coat you might expect for standing outside on Box Hill in rain. You can feel the damp air of the hill in that note, the cold settling into sleeves, the smell of wet leaves and chalky earth rising from the path. The taxi driver's memory became one of those details investigators would keep returning to. As he drove away, Ruth did not immediately hurry off. She appeared to stand still in the rain, or to look about, as though waiting or deciding. It is a small observation, and we have to hold it gently. A remembered pause is not proof of anything, but when a person disappears, even a pause can become a doorway investigators cannot stop looking through. You sit with that doorway for a moment. The hill is not empty, not exactly. Box Hill has paths, viewpoints, trees, slopes, and places where a person can be seen for a moment and then not seen. It has the hush of a beauty spot out of season, the creak of branches, the soft scrape of shoes on damp ground. Investigators had to think about all of it without letting the landscape become a story too soon. The search began that night, Police used the information from the taxi driver to focus on the Box Hill area, and then the search grew larger. There were officers, dogs, a helicopter, and heat-seeking equipment moving over a dark, wet landscape. You can imagine the sound of rotor blades overhead, not dramatic, just steady and mechanical, while people below worked through paths and bracken with torches in their hands. To investigate in those first hours was to balance hope with procedure. You check the obvious places. You ask whether someone has fallen, hidden, walked away, or met another person. You speak to family and friends. You test what is known against what could have happened. The file does not give you the comfort of choosing one answer. It asks you to keep several possibilities open. That is one of the quiet burdens of the Ruth Wilson case. The investigators could not assume she was nearby, and they could not assume she had gone far. They could not assume she wanted to be found, and they could not assume she did not. A missing person inquiry often begins in this wide space, where compassion has to sit beside discipline, and every hour feels both ordinary and important. As you read, the paper seems to carry the chill of that hill. Searches of open ground have their own rhythm. Boots sink into soft soil. Radio voices pass clipped messages between teams. A dog's lead tightens and slackens. Someone marks an area already covered. Someone else checks again, because the light changes everything, and what is invisible at night may appear in the morning. The early search did not find Ruth. That absence became part of the case. No clear trace appeared that could explain where she went after the taxi left. In a case like this, the lack of a discovery is not empty. It is information of a difficult kind. It tells investigators what they have not yet found, and it forces them to widen the map. You turn back to the day itself, because the day is where patient detective work often begins. Earlier that Monday, Ruth had taken a taxi into Dorking at around 11:30 in the morning. Around midday, she went to Thistle's Florists on Dorking High Street and ordered flowers for her stepmother Karen. She asked that they be delivered later, on Wednesday. You can imagine the shop air, warmer than the street, with the green smell of cut stems, damp paper, and ribbon near the counter. That floral order was not loud. It did not answer the case, but it was strange enough to be written down, and later, when the bouquet arrived, it would become one more object in the room. Investigators had to ask what it meant, while also knowing that gestures can be private. A bouquet can be apology, farewell, kindness, defiance, confusion, or something no one else can name. Ruth then spent time in Dorking Library. This detail gives the case another texture, quieter than the hill. You can picture the library air, warmed by radiators, carrying the dry smell of books and old carpet. A chair might scrape softly across the floor. Pages turn. Outside, the November afternoon lowers itself over the town. Inside, a girl leaves a trace only because someone later knows to ask. For detectives, libraries are patient places. Records sit in order. Staff remember faces sometimes, and sometimes they do not. A person can pass several hours, almost invisibly there, held in the ordinary silence that public buildings offer. When you sit with this part of the Ruth Wilson case, you begin to feel how investigation depends on small civic memories, the kind held by shopkeepers, librarians, taxi drivers, and friends. After the library, Ruth's route led toward Dorking railway station, and from there to the taxi that took her to Box Hill. The timing matters because it gives the day its spine. Morning taxi, florist, library, afternoon taxi, hill. Then uncertainty. You follow it slowly, not as a chase, but as a line drawn in pencil across a map. The pencil line stops in rain. That is where the investigators had to stand, almost literally. They had to put themselves on the roadside near the bridleway and ask what a 16-year-old girl might do next. You can feel the damp sleeve of a coat, the grit underfoot, the cold smell of parked cars and wet hedges. The question is not dramatic. It is practical. Which way would she have gone? There were paths and slopes, and there was Betchworth Quarry nearby. Searches later focused in that area too, especially after items were found. Reports described notes hidden under a bush in the undergrowth near the top edge of the quarry, along with empty packets of paracetamol and a partly full bottle of vermouth. We speak of these details carefully because they belong to a real young woman and a real family, and because objects can suggest possibilities without settling them. For investigators, those items would have been handled as evidence and as questions. Who wrote the notes? When were they placed there? Did they mean exactly what they seemed to mean, or were they part of something less clear? You can imagine an evidence bag crackling softly in gloved hands, the tacky feel of labels, the smell of damp earth still clinging to whatever came in from the hill. The notes themselves were not made public in full, and that privacy matters. A file is not the same as a story told for strangers. Some parts of an investigation remain held back, both to protect the integrity of the inquiry and to protect the living people around it. As we read, we respect the closed pages. We acknowledge they exist, and we do not force them open. This is what it was like, in part, to investigate the Ruth Wilson case. It meant living with evidence that pointed in more than one direction. It meant recognizing that a young person may leave signs of distress and still leave many questions unanswered. It meant searching a hillside and checking hospitals, friends, transport links, family history, and reports from the public, while never being able to close the file with confidence. When the next section of the file comes into view, it carries the softer weight of Ruth's life before that Monday. Ruth was not only a missing person in a report. She was a schoolgirl, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who worked a Saturday job in a music shop in Dorking. You can imagine that shop with cassette cases and compact discs in rows, the faint plastic smell of packaging, the small bell or door sound as customers came in from the street. These details matter because a missing person case is never just about absence. In the days before she vanished, Ruth saw friends. 2 days earlier, she worked her usual job, then went for a meal with her former boyfriend Will Kennedy and another friend, Neil Phillipson. Reports say she paid for the meal. You place that note gently beside the florist receipt. Paying for dinner can be ordinary. It can also feel different when a person disappears soon after. On the Sunday before her disappearance, Ruth went to handbell practice at the local church, then to a youth group in Dorking, and later to supper at Will Kennedy's home. His mother gave her some old clothing. The file records these simple movements, and you can almost hear the soft ring of bells in a church space, the smell of polished wood, the small warmth of people gathering before evening. Family members later remembered her seeming relaxed. That is another difficult kind of detail. When someone disappears, every remembered expression is revisited, and ordinary calm may become puzzling in hindsight. You, as the detective tonight, have to resist pressing too hard on it. A relaxed appearance is real, but it may not tell the whole truth. People can carry heavy thoughts quietly. Ruth's background included a painful family history. Her mother, Nesta, died when Ruth was very young, and Ruth had long been given an explanation that did not contain the full truth. Later, she learned that Nesta had died by suicide. We hold that fact softly, without prying into it. It is enough to understand that the discovery mattered deeply, and that it became part of how investigators and those close to Ruth understood the months before she vanished. To investigate this part of the Ruth Wilson case was to listen. Friends remembered conversations. Family remembered moods. People tried to explain what had changed and what had not. You can picture detectives sitting in modest rooms with notebooks open, hearing kettles click off in kitchens, smelling damp coats drying near radiators, waiting while someone searches memory for the right words. Memory is not a machine. It comes with pauses. A friend may remember one phrase clearly and lose the day around it. A parent may remember the sound of a door closing, but not the exact time. Investigators have to treat memory with care, neither dismissing it nor making it stronger than it is. In cold cases, that care becomes even more important because time can soften edges and deepen certain impressions. Ruth was said to have spent time looking into her mother's death, including visiting records with someone close to her. That discovery, if you sit with it quietly, helps explain why investigators took her emotional state seriously. It does not explain everything. It is not a complete answer, but it is one of the threads in the file, and you can feel how carefully it had to be handled. There is a human tenderness in this kind of detective work. You are not only collecting facts, you are asking people to revisit rooms they would rather leave closed. You are asking them to speak of a teenager as she was, not as the mystery made her. That requires patience, because grief and memory do not answer on command. The family home, the school, the church, the music shop, the library, the florist, the taxi rank, and the hill all become part of one map. Not a map of drama, a map of contact. Where was Ruth seen? Who spoke to her? What did she carry? What did she leave behind? The questions are plain, and their plainness is part of their weight. You linger over what Ruth carried. A small blue duffel bag was mentioned in reports, with a personal stereo and tapes among her belongings. That detail belongs very much to 1995. You can almost feel the smooth plastic of a cassette case, the pressure of foam headphones against the ear, the click of a button pressed down. It places Ruth in her time, before mobile phones made everyone easier to trace. That absence of modern digital traces shaped the investigation. There were no smartphone location records to follow, no instant messages stored in clouds, no bank card movements spreading a neat trail across databases. Investigators worked with witnesses, paper records, telephone calls, and physical searches. You feel the slower pace of it, the way a lead had to be found by speaking to someone, then written down, then checked. It is tempting, years later, to imagine that one more camera or one more signal would have answered everything. Perhaps it would have helped. Perhaps not. The Ruth Wilson case belongs to a time when a person could move through a small town and leave only human traces behind. A florist remembered an order. A taxi driver remembered a passenger. Friends remembered meals and conversations. The hill remembered nothing in words. That is why the case file feels both detailed and incomplete. It is full of real things, and still it opens into mist. You can have a date, a place, a clothing description, a taxi journey, a bouquet, a library visit, and a last sighting, and still not know where someone went. The patient investigator learns to sit with that discomfort without filling it too quickly. The next pages bring you back to Box Hill, where searchers returned again and again. Box Hill is not just a point on a map. It is wooded paths, chalk ground, viewpoints, slopes, and changing weather. In late November, the light leaves early. The air can feel raw against the face. Leaves collect in wet layers under hedges. A person searching there would hear boots pressing into mud, radios murmuring, and the breath of people moving carefully through uneven ground. Police, fire and rescue personnel, volunteers, local community members, school friends, colleagues, and National Trust wardens were all part of later search efforts. A large search was organized in the days after Ruth vanished, including teams working around the Betchworth quarry end of Box Hill. You can imagine clipboards being held under coat fronts to keep the paper dry, maps softening at the folds, torches moving in pale arcs. Search work is repetitive by design. You cover an area, mark it, and move on. You check places that feel likely and places that feel unlikely. You look beneath undergrowth, along paths, near edges, behind structures, and into hollows where leaves gather. The work can feel slow enough to test everyone's patience, but that slowness is the point. Careful searching is how uncertainty is narrowed. To investigate the Ruth Wilson case on the ground meant accepting the demands of terrain. A hillside does not arrange itself for detectives. Weather changes visibility. Mud preserves some marks and erases others. Fallen leaves hide small objects. People searching must keep their attention low and steady, even when they are cold, tired, and aware that the family is waiting. The use of a helicopter and thermal equipment shows how seriously the early search was treated. But technology, especially in that period, was not magic. It could help look for heat signatures, movement, and broad areas, yet it could not read intention. It could not say whether Ruth had remained on the hill, met someone, taken another route, or left before searchers fully understood the pattern of her day. That is one reason the taxi driver's account remained important. He anchored Ruth to a particular place and time. Investigators could work outward from that point. They could ask who was on the hill then, who drove nearby, who walked past, who noticed a girl in a red jumper. You can feel how every answer would have been written down, sorted, compared, and sometimes set aside. The clothing description would have traveled through appeals. Red knitted jumper, black velvet trousers, black pixie boots, a small watch on her left wrist. These details are intimate, in a way public appeals often are. They take private clothing and turn it into a shared memory aid, because someone, somewhere, might have seen a flash of red against rain-dark trees. There is a quiet sadness in that process. A family's loved one becomes a description. Height, age, clothing, last known location. Investigators need those facts, and the public needs them too. But behind each line is a person who woke up that morning with no idea she would become a missing poster. You hold that in the room with you as the file lies open. The searchers found no solid explanation. That phrase, no solid explanation, has the feel of cold stone. It does not mean no work was done. It means work met silence. And when work meets silence in a missing person case, investigators begin the longer labor of following reports, revisiting statements, and living with possibilities that cannot yet be dismissed. Some inquiries burn hot for a few days, then settle into boxes. The Ruth Wilson case did both. It began with urgency because a teenager was missing. Then, as days became weeks, the file entered another kind of time. Leads still mattered, but they arrived unevenly. Appeals were made, newspapers wrote, people phoned with sightings, detectives checked what they could. You turn the page to the public appeals, and the atmosphere changes from wet hillside to newspaper ink and television studio light. Ian and Karen Wilson appeared publicly to ask for information, and reports described their hope that Ruth might still be alive and afraid to come home. You can imagine the studio air, feeling too warm, the brightness of lights, the unnatural stillness of waiting to speak. For a family, an appeal is both practical and deeply personal. It turns private worry outward, hoping someone listening will know something. Investigators use appeals because cases need the public. A missing person may be seen by a stranger on a bus, a shop worker, a walker, a station clerk, or someone who does not yet understand the importance of what they noticed. In 1995, that meant newspapers, local television, posters, and word of mouth carrying the description beyond the first search area. The Ruth Wilson case moved through that public space quietly but persistently. Local papers carried details. People in Dorking and nearby villages heard her name. Box Hill became not just a beauty spot, but the place where the known trail ended. You can imagine a newspaper folded on a kitchen table, print smudging faintly on fingertips, someone reading and trying to remember whether they had seen anything. Sightings came in. Some were nearby. Some, over the years, were much farther away. Investigators had to follow them without letting hope do the work. Facts must do. That is one of the hardest parts of a long missing person inquiry. Every possible sighting may matter, but many will not be the person. Each one still asks for time, travel, phone calls, comparisons, and care. On the first anniversary of Ruth's disappearance, a girl thought by some to resemble her was captured on CCTV in a Dorking newsagent's shop. Reports said she asked for local newspapers and became upset when one had sold out. The shopkeeper saved the footage and contacted police. You can picture the grainy quality of old CCTV, the fixed angle, the flat shop lighting, and the difficulty of certainty. Ruth's parents believed the girl in the footage was their daughter. Others could not say with certainty. For investigators, such footage is both valuable and limited. It gives an image, but not always an answer. Faces blur, angles mislead, timestamps help, but they cannot explain why a person was there. You sit with that screen in your mind, not forcing it to become more than it is. The newsagent sighting is one of those details that keeps a case alive in public memory. It feels close, it feels possible. It brings Ruth back into Dorking, if it was Ruth near the place she knew. But the phrase "if it was Ruth" must stay with us. Patient detective work depends on that kind of honesty. Hope is human. Certainty must be earned. Other sightings were described in the weeks after she vanished, including reports from people who thought they knew her well. Police later said fairly reliable sightings had been followed up. That phrase, fairly reliable, has its own careful weight. It suggests something more than a vague resemblance, but still less than proof. You can almost hear an officer choosing the words slowly. Following sightings is a particular kind of labor. You call the witness. You ask when, where, how close, what light, what clothing, what direction, who else was present. You compare the report to known timelines. You look for patterns. Sometimes the witness is sure. Sometimes they become less sure under gentle questioning. Sometimes their memory improves, and sometimes it dissolves. For the listener sitting with the file tonight, this work may feel like turning the same page more than once. That is what investigators often do. They return to statements. They reread original notes. They ask whether an old report was dismissed too quickly or held too tightly. In a cold case, patience is not passive. It is active attention over many years. As the Ruth Wilson case aged, it entered the realm of review. The file did not vanish simply because the first searches failed. Surrey police continued to regard it as a missing person inquiry, and reviews of the case considered several broad possibilities: accident, abduction, suicide, murder, or Ruth leaving to start a new life were all named publicly as explanations that had to be kept in mind. Those possibilities sit uneasily beside one another. Some are painful, some are uncertain. One offers the thought that Ruth may have lived elsewhere under another life, but none has been proven. To investigate well is not to choose the explanation that feels most comforting or most dramatic. It is to ask what evidence supports each path, and what evidence is missing. The cold case investigator's desk has a different sound from the first search. Less radio traffic, more paper, more quiet. You can imagine a records room with metal shelving, cardboard boxes, old labels, and the faint smell of dust and toner. A folder comes down from a shelf. The corners are soft. The ink has faded slightly. Someone opens it because a new review, anniversary, or appeal has made the case speak again. In that room, the Ruth Wilson case becomes both past and present. The events belong to 1995, but the question remains current because Ruth has not been found. Every review has to respect the original work while being willing to test it. Were all witnesses recontacted? Were all sightings logged? Were any names repeated? Were there details modern methods might interpret differently? Modern tools can help, but only where material exists for them to work on. If there are physical items, they may be reconsidered under newer forensic standards. If there are statements, they may be compared in databases or mapped more cleanly. But many missing person cases still depend on human memory, and human memory does not become easier with time. You can feel the years passing in the file. 1995 becomes the first anniversary, then the 10th, then 13 years, then more. Appeals are renewed, reporters return. Friends who were teenagers become adults, carrying a memory from school corridors, church halls, cafes, and the streets of Dorking. The case changes because everyone around it changes, while Ruth remains 16 in the public record. That is one of the tender difficulties here. Ruth's life, as known to the investigation, pauses at the Hill. Everyone else continues. Detectives retire. Friends move. Shops change. The hand in hand becomes known by another name. Technology changes almost beyond recognition. Yet the question stays simple and unresolved. What happened to Ruth Wilson after she got out of that taxi on Box Hill? You close no page yet. You only rest your hand on it for a moment, feeling the slight ridge where papers have been clipped together for years. The room is quiet. The lamp is warm. Outside, if you imagine it, rain still moves softly against the dark window. And in the next part of the file, the investigation turns again toward the people who remembered Ruth, because in a case this patient, memory itself becomes a kind of evidence. The people who remembered Ruth did not all remember the same version of her, and that is one of the first things you learn when you sit with this file for long enough. A family remembers one set of rooms, one set of habits, one voice at the breakfast table, while friends remember another rhythm entirely, the rhythm of school corridors, shared jokes, late buses, music shops, and private conversations that may never have reached home. Investigators had to move carefully between those worlds, because a missing teenager can appear different depending on who is speaking, and each account may still be true in its own quiet way. You can imagine a detective returning to the same names again, not because anyone has done anything wrong, but because the shape of a life is built from small repeated contacts. A friend remembers Ruth talking about her mother. Another remembers a change in mood. Someone else recalls her being calm, even cheerful, on the weekend before she disappeared. The paper takes all of it in, and the paper does not know which detail will matter later. In the Ruth Wilson case, the question of what Ruth knew about her mother's death became one of the softest and most difficult parts of the inquiry. It was not the sort of fact that could be handled like a train ticket or a taxi receipt. It belonged to grief, identity, childhood memory, and family silence. You can feel the room grow still around that section of the file, as though even the pages understand that some truths arrive late and leave a person standing differently in the world. Ruth had believed, for much of her childhood, that her mother Nesta had died in a car crash. Later, she learned that this was not true, and that Nesta had died by suicide when Ruth was very young. That knowledge was not only a correction of a fact, it was the reopening of a whole private history. You can picture investigators hearing this from people close to her, pens moving more slowly, because facts like these require gentleness as well as accuracy. There were reports that Ruth had visited records relating to her mother and that she had been trying to understand what had really happened. To investigate that patiently meant asking what she had learned, when she had learned it, and who had known how deeply it affected her. These are not clean questions. They pass through family loyalty, teenage privacy, and the simple human wish to protect someone from pain. You sit with them because the file asks you to, but you do not force them into a single answer. The family situation had more than one layer. Ruth's father, Ian, had remarried, and Karen was Ruth's stepmother. Ruth and Karen's relationship, like many family relationships, was described in ways that could not be reduced to one plain line. There were ordinary tensions, ordinary kindnesses, and things people only understood fully afterward, if they understood them at all. The bouquet Ruth ordered for Karen sits in that complicated space. wrapped in tissue paper and meaning no one can quite unfold. You may pause over the flowers again, because they are one of the case's most hauntingly ordinary objects. Ruth ordered them in person during the day she disappeared and arranged delivery for Wednesday, 2 days later. The shop would have had buckets of stems, damp floors, colored paper, and perhaps the small metallic snip of scissors from behind the counter. In detective terms, the order fixed her in a place and gave the day another timestamp. In human terms, it felt like a message, but messages can be misread, especially when the sender is gone. Investigators had to ask whether the flowers suggested farewell, apology, affection, planning, or something that made sense only to Ruth. You hold each possibility lightly, as a detective must. The bouquet arrived after she was missing, entering a house already changed by worry, and it became part of the investigation not because flowers are unusual, but because timing can turn an ordinary kindness into evidence. You can almost see the delivery note, the florist's paper, and the careful handwriting of an order book. It is a modest kind of record, but in a case without a final answer, modest records become anchors. The person behind the counter may remember her voice, her manner, whether she seemed hurried, withdrawn, or calm. A detective asks those questions, and then asks them again in another way, because the truth may live in the difference between what someone noticed and what someone interpreted. This is where the Ruth Wilson case teaches patience. People often want a single detail to carry the whole story, but the file refuses that. The flowers do not solve it. The taxi ride does not solve it. The rain on Box Hill does not solve it. Each detail adds weight, but none gives permission to stop looking. You turn the page, and the next page asks you to keep going. In a long inquiry, investigators learn the sound of almost. A sighting is almost certain. A memory is almost clear. A theory almost fits. You can hear that word in the quiet between interviews, when an officer closes a notebook and knows there is more work ahead. The Ruth Wilson case is full of these nearly solid things, and the work was to honor them without pretending they were stronger than they were. A friend's account may say Ruth was cheerful. Another may describe her as troubled. The two can exist together. Anyone who has known a young person in distress understands that moods do not arrive in neat categories, and that public calm can sit beside private difficulty. As you read, you are asked to remember not only the facts, but the limits of what facts can show about an inner life. The investigators also had to keep in mind the ordinary freedoms of a 16-year-old. Ruth moved through Dorking, visited the library, ordered flowers, took taxis, and met friends. She was old enough to make choices that others did not immediately understand, yet young enough that every absence carried urgent concern. You can feel that balance in the paperwork, between respecting her agency and protecting her as a missing child. The day before she disappeared, she had been among people who knew her. Handbell practice, youth group, supper at Will Kennedy's house, donated clothes from his mother. These are warm, domestic details, and they sit strangely close to the cold hill of the next afternoon. You can almost hear cutlery on plates, quiet conversation, the sound of a front door closing after a Sunday evening visit. Then the file turns, and Monday begins. When investigators reconstructed Monday, they were not only tracing movement, they were tracing intention, which is far harder. A route can be mapped, but intention hides inside the pauses between stops. Ruth did not simply vanish from home without trace that morning. She followed a sequence. She arranged transport. She entered public places. She made a purchase. She waited through hours in a library. Then she went toward Box Hill. To you, reading now, the library hours may feel especially still. It is easy to imagine Ruth sitting among shelves, perhaps with papers, perhaps simply passing time. A library shelters people without demanding much from them. There is the soft thump of returned books, the whisper of pages, the dry warmth of radiators, and the faint smell of dust in the bindings. It was a place where a person could be present and private at once. For detectives, that privacy becomes a challenge. They can ask staff whether they saw her. They can ask what she read, if anyone knows. They can check whether she used records or asked questions. But much of a library visit may leave no mark. You sit with the silence of those hours, because the silence itself is part of the case. It is not empty. It is simply unrecorded. The Ruth Wilson case belongs to that particular era, just before lives became heavily digitized. Today, investigators might look for phone pings, messaging apps, search histories, transport cards, and bank records updated in minutes. In 1995, they looked for people who remembered seeing her and objects that could be touched. The evidence had texture: paper receipts, witness statements, taxi logs, library recollections, florist records, and the physical ground of Box Hill all had to be brought into conversation. You can feel how much human labor that required. Someone had to knock on doors, phone local businesses, speak to bus drivers, check railway stations, and ask walkers whether they had seen a girl in a red jumper. Someone had to take each answer seriously enough to write it down. Someone had to decide which leads needed urgent follow-up and which needed to be kept for later review. That work can seem ordinary from the outside, but ordinary work is how missing person investigations are built. The detective's pen scratches. The kettle in an interview room cools. A map is unfolded and refolded until the creases begin to split. Names are underlined. Times are circled. And all the while, the person at the center of the file remains just beyond reach. As the early days passed, the inquiry widened from Box Hill into the surrounding towns and routes. Dorking, Betchworth, Leatherhead, Redhill, Guildford, London, and places farther away could not be dismissed too easily, because a teenager with enough time and help might travel. Investigators had to ask whether Ruth planned to leave, whether anyone assisted her, whether she had money, and whether she had contacts not immediately known to her family. The possibility that Ruth had started a new life has always lived in the case, but not comfortably. It asks for logistics. Where would she go? Who would help her? How would she remain hidden so long? It also asks for emotional questions, because starting over at 16 is not a simple phrase when you place it inside a real life. You hold it as a possibility, not as an answer. There were reported sightings in various places over time, and some seemed stronger than others. A later sighting was said to have come from someone close enough to believe they recognized Ruth in Dorking. Another, from farther afield, suggested she might be alive elsewhere. You can picture the investigators' careful routine each time, taking the call, recording the description, comparing details, and trying to keep hope from making the witness more certain than the facts allowed. Hope is useful in a missing person case, but it can also distort the light. Families need it. Detectives understand it. Witnesses may be moved by it. Yet the file must remain steady. You, sitting beside the lamp, can feel the discipline of that steadiness. It is not coldness. It is care, because careless certainty can wound people almost as deeply as silence. The first anniversary CCTV sighting in the Dorking newsagent's shop became one of those moments where hope and discipline met each other. The girl on the footage looked enough like Ruth for the report to matter. She asked for local newspapers, and according to accounts, became upset when one had sold out. The detail feels personal, almost intimate, as though someone might have been checking what was being written about the case. If you imagine the footage, keep it soft and imperfect. This was not high-definition clarity. It was a fixed camera, shop lighting, movement, grain, and a face that could be interpreted. The shop would have smelled of newspapers, sweets, damp coats, and ink. The till may have clicked. Outside, the pavement of Dorking would have carried ordinary footsteps, people passing without knowing they might be near something important. Investigators had to ask what the footage could prove. Was it Ruth? Could it be someone who resembled her? Did the behavior connect to the anniversary, or was that meaning added afterward? The questions were not dismissive. They were necessary. In the Ruth Wilson case, as in many old inquiries, the most compelling details are not always the most conclusive ones. For Ruth's parents, believing it was her must have carried a particular ache. You can understand that without needing to resolve the image. To see, or think you see, your missing daughter on a screen after a year would be both a gift and a wound. It would say she might be alive, while also saying she had not come home. The file holds that human contradiction quietly. Other sightings did not settle the matter either. A person may resemble a missing teenager in a crowd, especially when the public has seen a photograph. Hair, posture, clothing, and age can draw the mind toward recognition. Detectives learn to separate the generous impulse to help from the evidence that can be verified. They do not blame the witness for being uncertain. They simply keep working. Over time, there were appeals for Ruth to make contact if she was alive. Her family said she would be welcomed home. Police left room for the possibility that she had left voluntarily and was still living under another identity. This is one of the gentler features of some missing person investigations. The file is not only a search for evidence, it is also, sometimes, an open door. You can feel that open door in the language of appeals. If you are out there, let us know. If you cannot come home, at least tell someone you are safe. These words are practical, but they are also tender. They admit that a person may have reasons for staying away and still deserve care. They ask for one small proof of life, one line, one call, one message carried through proper channels. In the Ruth Wilson case, no such proof came that could close the inquiry. That absence kept the investigation from becoming one thing. It could not be treated only as a voluntary disappearance because no confirmed contact followed. It could not be treated only as an accident because no body or clear trace was found. It could not be treated only as an offense because the evidence did not publicly establish that either. The case stayed open because it had to. You may notice, as you sit with these pages, how often good investigation means refusing the comfort of a neat story. The human mind likes shape. It wants beginning, middle, and end. But the file gives you beginning, middle, and an unresolved space where the end should be. Patient detective work means entering that space without trying to decorate it. The next box from the shelf is heavier with later years, and the air around it smells less of rain and more of storage. Cold case review has its own atmosphere. It is quieter than an active search, and in some ways more exacting. The first urgency has passed, but responsibility remains. You can imagine a review team at a desk, fluorescent lights humming above, old photographs spread beside newer printouts, names entered into systems that did not exist when Ruth first went missing. The past is not changed, but the tools around it are. In reviewing the Ruth Wilson case, investigators had to decide what could still be tested. Original witness statements could be read again. Known sightings could be rechecked. Locations could be revisited. Family and friends could be spoken to with the distance of years. Every review carries the hope that time may have changed something, even if the physical evidence has not. Time changes witnesses in more than one direction. Some details fade, others become easier to speak aloud. A person who was young at the time may understand an old conversation differently as an adult. Someone who stayed silent out of loyalty, fear, embarrassment, or uncertainty may eventually decide that even a small memory should be shared. The patient investigator leaves room for that. You can imagine an officer making a call many years later, voice gentle, asking whether the person would be willing to talk again. On the other end, there may be a pause, the soft hiss of a phone line, a kettle in the background, a breath taken before the past is entered. These moments are not cinematic, they are ordinary and brave. They are how old cases continue to move. The Ruth Wilson case was reviewed publicly at later anniversaries, with police restating that the investigation remained open and that several possibilities were still being considered. This matters because an open case is not a forgotten case. It means information can still be received. It means old leads can still be tested. It means the name Ruth Wilson still has a place in the work of people tasked with finding answers. Cold case work often begins by sorting, not solving, sorting. You place statements in order. You identify original source material. You separate confirmed facts from media retellings, from family belief, from public speculation. You check whether a reported sighting was first-hand or passed through someone else. You note what was witnessed, what was inferred, and what was only felt. That distinction is especially important here in the Ruth Wilson case. Many details carry emotional force. The flowers, the notes, the learning of her mother's death, the rain on Box Hill, the anniversary footage, each can pull the mind toward a story. But a review team has to ask, quietly and again, what each item proves and what it merely suggests. This is not a lack of compassion. It is the shape compassion takes when truth is the goal. You can picture the evidence table as a series of small islands. The taxi journey is one island. The florist is another. The library is another. The quarry items are another. The sightings form a chain of uncertain islands stretching outward through time. The investigator's task is to see whether any bridge between them is real, or whether the water between them remains too wide. The notes found near the quarry must have received close attention. We know enough to say they were described as farewell notes, and that they were linked to Ruth. We do not need to quote them or open them further. Their existence mattered, but their interpretation was not simple enough to end the case. If it had been, the file might have closed very differently. There are many reasons a note may not close an inquiry. It may raise questions about timing. It may not match other behavior. It may appear to point one way while the physical search points nowhere. It may belong to someone who later changed their mind. It may have been written under emotional pressure that does not explain what happened next. You keep each possibility on the table because the file has not released it. The items found with the notes also mattered. Empty packets of painkillers and a partly full bottle of vermouth were reported. Those details were handled by investigators, and we handle them in words with restraint. They suggest concern for Ruth's safety, and they explain why the searches near Box Hill were taken seriously. But without finding Ruth, those objects remained part of a question rather than an ending. You can feel how hard that must have been for everyone searching. Objects can make absence feel closer. A bag, a note, a bottle, a packet, a piece of clothing, or a personal item may seem to say a person has just stepped beyond view. Yet the ground gives no answer. The wind moves through the trees. The quarry stays still. Searchers move on and return, because there is nothing else to do. When no body is found, the investigation cannot settle into one category. That is true in practical terms and emotional ones. Police cannot confirm death. Family cannot grieve in the ordinary way. Friends cannot know whether memory should be kept as mourning or hope. The case becomes a long waiting room, and everyone connected to it sits there in different ways. You, reading now, may notice how often the file returns to the same few places. Betchworth, Dorking, Box Hill, the quarry, the florist, the library. These places become familiar not because they reveal everything, but because investigators had to walk through them again and again. Old mysteries often feel large, but they are built from small geography, from the distances a person could travel in one day. Dorking in late November would have offered ordinary cover for a private mind. Shop windows, wet pavements, station platforms, library shelves, narrow roads, and the constant movement of people who do not expect to become witnesses. You can imagine Ruth among them, noticeable only afterward. This is a hard truth of missing person work. Most of us pass through the world unrecorded most of the time. The taxi drivers in the case became important because taxis create records and memories. A driver notices where a passenger gets in, where she asks to go, whether she speaks much, whether she pays normally. The cab itself becomes a small moving interview room, though neither person knows it at the time. There is the smell of the heater, the soft rattle of change, and rain stitching the windscreen. Ruth used a taxi in the morning, and later another taxi carried her from Dorking railway station to Box Hill. For investigators, these were not merely transport details. They showed planning. They showed movement independent of school and family. They showed that Ruth knew how to get where she wanted to go. You note that carefully, because planning can mean many things, and the case does not allow you to choose quickly. The driver who dropped her near Box Hill recalled that she paid and got out. Reports say he saw her standing in the rain as he drove away. You can return to that image many times and still not exhaust it. A teenager beside a road, a red jumper in grey weather, a hill rising around her, a taxi leaving. The file does not tell you what she thought next. A patient detective might visit the spot more than once, at different times of day, in different weather. You would want to know what could be seen from the road, what paths invited the eye, what shelter existed, how far sound carried, how quickly someone could disappear from view. You would stand there with traffic passing behind you and ask not one question, but several quiet ones. Could Ruth have walked into the woods? Could she have met someone by arrangement? Could she have been picked up by another vehicle? Could she have hidden briefly and then moved on? Could she have gone toward the quarry? Could she have changed plans? Each question has a practical side. Distance, time, weather, clothing, footwear, money, familiarity with the area, witnesses. This is where investigation becomes almost humble. It admits how much can happen in a few unobserved minutes. A person can turn left instead of right. A car can pause. A path can be chosen. A decision can change. If no one sees it, the file receives only the absence afterward. You feel that humility in the way careful investigators phrase possibilities rather than declarations. The Ruth Wilson case has sometimes been described through theories, but the work behind it was less dramatic than theory making. It was checking, rechecking, asking, walking, waiting, reviewing, appeals, notes, calls, files. The patient work is not glamorous, and it does not always produce resolution, but without it, the unresolved would become the unexamined, and those are not the same. You turn another page, and the file seems to breathe out the sound of old media reports. Newspapers and television can help a missing person inquiry, but they also shape the way a case is remembered. Certain details become repeated because they are vivid. The flowers, the hill, the taxi, the notes, the anniversary footage. Over time, these details can feel almost fixed in public imagination, while quieter facts recede. Investigators have to keep the whole file in view, including the parts that never made strong headlines. You can imagine a detective comparing a media article to the original statement and marking the difference. A time slightly simplified, a location described loosely, a witness quote shortened. None of this may be malicious. It is the nature of public storytelling. But the police file has to be more exact than memory or media, because exactness may be the only way forward. The family also had to live with public attention, and that attention is never simple. Appeals can bring information. They can also bring speculation, mistakes, and strangers forming opinions from fragments. In the Ruth Wilson case, as in many disappearances, the people closest to Ruth were asked to keep speaking into a public space while carrying private uncertainty. You can feel the strain of that, even from a distance. There is a particular tenderness in cases where someone may still be alive. Every word has to leave room. Too much finality may feel like abandonment. Too much optimism may feel impossible. Families often learn to speak in a middle language, one that says please come home, please make contact, please tell us something, while also knowing that years have passed with no confirmed answer. For police, that middle language has operational value too. If Ruth left voluntarily, An appeal may reach her or someone who knows her. If someone else knows what happened, the passage of years may loosen silence. If a sighting was real, fresh publicity may connect it to another memory. The file remains open to information because closure has not been earned. You might think of old cases as still, but they are often quietly moving. A renewed appeal produces calls. A documentary or article brings an email. A retired officer remembers a detail. A citizen cleaning out papers finds a note from years ago. A person who was young then grows older and decides to speak. Each movement is small, like dust, lifting in a beam of light, but sometimes small movement matters. In the Ruth Wilson case, every renewed appeal had to pass through the same central uncertainty. Was Ruth alive? Was she somewhere beyond the life she had known? Did something happen on or near Box Hill? Did the notes mean what they appeared to mean? Was the CCTV sighting meaningful? Did someone withhold a piece of information, perhaps without understanding its value? None of these questions could be dismissed entirely. That is a difficult posture for investigators. To hold many possibilities is mentally tiring. It is easier to choose one and arrange everything around it. But good cold case work resists that temptation. You can see the discipline of it in the language used by police over the years, acknowledging several potential explanations rather than publicly settling on one without evidence. The sensory world of the file changes as years pass. The first pages smell of wet ground, fresh ink, and hurried photocopies. Later pages smell of archives, dust, and printer paper from newer systems. Old photographs are handled beside digital scans. Maps are replaced by aerial images, yet the same places remain, and the same question is written in newer fonts. What happened to Ruth Wilson? You can sit for a while with the photograph most people know. Ruth's face young and still, preserved by repetition, in articles and appeals. Missing person photographs become public objects, but they begin as family images. Someone chose that picture because it looked like her, or because it was available, or because it held a familiar expression. Over time, it becomes how strangers remember someone they never met. A detective has to look beyond the photograph without losing the person. Ruth was not only the girl in the appeal, she had habits, preferences, friendships, frustrations, and private thoughts. She worked in a music shop, spent time with friends, went to church activities, and moved through the streets of Surrey with the ordinariness of a life still forming. The file must keep that person alive in more than one dimension. This is why conversations with friends mattered so much. Friends may know small things adults miss. A favorite tape, a plan mentioned once, a place someone wanted to visit, a worry shared in confidence, a feeling about home, a joke that changed meaning later. You can imagine those interviews, some formal, some softer, with young people trying to help while still barely understanding the scale of what had happened. The investigators had to ask questions that may have felt intrusive. Did Ruth talk about leaving? Did she mention money? Did she say goodbye in unusual ways? Did she ask about travel? Did she seem worried about anyone? Did she trust someone outside the usual circle? These questions are necessary, but they can make ordinary memories feel heavy, as though every conversation before the disappearance has been placed under glass. You, as the detective tonight, can understand why such interviews must be gentle. Teenagers do not always speak directly. They hint, test, exaggerate, withdraw, and confide unevenly. A sentence that sounded casual on Sunday may feel important on Tuesday. A gift of clothing may feel kind at the time and puzzling later. Investigators had to respect the uncertainty of adolescence itself. The Saturday meal with Will Kennedy and Neil Phillipson carried details that invited questions. Ruth paid. She spent time with people she knew. Reports suggest nothing overtly alarming was noticed by those present. Again, the file gives no simple signal. You can hear the background of a restaurant or cafe, the low clink of plates, the smell of warm food, the dull winter dark pressing against windows. The Sunday supper at Will's home adds another domestic scene. Ruth received old clothing from his mother. That detail has been repeated because it feels like preparation, or perhaps just kindness, depending on how you look at it. A detective cannot ignore that ambiguity. Clothing can be practical, it can be casual, it can be connected to a plan, it can mean almost nothing. The file keeps it because almost nothing can later become something. Then Monday arrives with its own quiet precision. School is missed, taxis are taken, flowers are ordered. The library holds her for hours. The station becomes a point of departure. The hill becomes the edge of what is known. If you trace it with your finger, the route has the clarity of a line and the mystery of an unfinished sentence. No one investigating the Ruth Wilson case could avoid the question of planning. Ruth seemed to make deliberate choices that day. She did not simply wander without direction, but deliberate choices can lead toward many different outcomes. A person may plan to disappear, plan to think, plan to meet someone, plan a symbolic act, plan to be alone, or begin with one plan and change it when the weather, emotions, or another person intervenes. This is why the last sighting is so important and so incomplete. The taxi driver sees only the handover between known movement and unknown movement. His account is like a gate in the file. Before it, investigators can reconstruct. After it, they infer. You stand at that gate as long as necessary, because every old case has at least one place where knowledge thins. The rain itself becomes part of the remembered scene. Not a dramatic storm, just November wetness, the kind that seeps into cuffs and darkens wool. It would have affected visibility, comfort, and the behavior of anyone waiting outside. It may have made people less likely to linger, less likely to notice others, more likely to stay in vehicles. Weather is not just atmosphere in a case file. It is a condition of evidence. You think about Ruth's clothing again. A red knitted jumper might stand out, but only if someone was looking. Black velvet trousers and pixie boots were not practical search clothing for a long wet walk. Yet young people often dress for identity, not weather. Investigators would have held both thoughts at once. Clothing can suggest intention, but it cannot define it. If she intended to walk far, the clothing seems odd. If she intended to meet someone, it may make more sense. If she intended to remain near the quarry, another interpretation emerges. If she planned to leave and change clothes later, yet another opens. You can see how quickly theories branch and how little certainty each branch contains. A patient detective trims nothing without reason. The landscape around Betchworth Quarry offered both open and concealed areas, which complicated the search. Quarries change the way sound and sight behave. Edges, dips, scrub, and chalky ground create pockets where someone might be hard to see. You can imagine the pale exposed earth, the smell of wet stone, the thin wind, and the careful steps of searchers near uneven ground. Search teams do not move like people out for a walk. They move in patterns. They watch the ground. They call to one another. They hold back branches. They stop for small objects and then decide whether those objects matter. A sweet wrapper, a torn bit of paper, a footprint too blurred to use, a scrap of fabric caught on a twig. Most things will mean nothing. Some cannot be dismissed. The discovery of the notes and related items near the quarry gave investigators a physical focus, but not a final answer. That distinction is essential. Evidence can focus a search without resolving a disappearance. It can suggest Ruth had been there. It can suggest emotional distress. It can direct resources. But without her, and without a confirmed sequence after the taxi, the inquiry remained open. You can feel the frustration in that, though the file would not say it plainly. Investigators are trained to keep working, but they are human. A lead that almost explains a case may be more difficult than no lead at all. It gives shape to hope and then withholds the last piece. The Ruth Wilson case seems to have done that again and again. When weeks pass in a missing person case, the pace changes. The phones do not stop entirely, but they ring differently. Search teams are not out every hour. Reporters move on and then return. Family routines continue because they must, though nothing feels ordinary. The case file thickens. The world outside goes into December, then another year, while the first Monday remains fixed. You may imagine a detective revisiting the folder after the holidays, with cold hands around the paper cup of tea, reading the same statements in the hope that a missed connection will appear. The room may be too bright, the clock too loud, the office carpet worn under rolling chairs. There is nothing glamorous about this work. It is persistence made visible in paper and tired eyes. The Ruth Wilson case also required investigators to think about family history without allowing it to become destiny. Ruth's discovery about her mother mattered. Her feelings mattered. But a painful discovery does not automatically explain a disappearance. People respond to grief and shock in many ways. A careful investigator asks whether it contributed, how it contributed, and whether other factors were present, while resisting the simplicity of a single cause. That resistance is compassionate. It protects Ruth from being reduced to one event in her family history. She was more than the loss of her mother. She was more than the lies or silences around that loss. She was a full young person with relationships, decisions, and a day that unfolded through several public places. The case deserves all those dimensions. As you sit with this section, you may notice that the file often asks adults to revisit what they thought they were doing for a child. Protecting someone from painful truth can come from love, fear, or confusion. Later, that protection may feel like betrayal to the person who learns what was hidden. Investigators did not need to judge that history in simple terms. They needed to understand its possible effect. Understanding is not the same as blame. That is an important distinction in the Ruth Wilson case. Family members, friends, and witnesses all became part of the inquiry because they were close to Ruth or close to the events. That does not mean they held the answer. It means their memories formed the evidence available. You hold them with care, as real people living inside a hard uncertainty. Long cases often generate public theories, and public theories can be heavy for families. Some people argue for voluntary disappearance. Others believe she died near Box Hill. Others wonder whether someone else was involved. A detective can read theories, but the file must return to evidence. You return with it, quietly, because speculation can feel active while actually moving nowhere. The evidence keeps bringing us back to practical questions. Did Ruth have enough money to travel or live elsewhere? Did she have identification? Did she take clothing? Did she know anyone outside her usual circle? Were there signs of preparation at home? Did she speak of future plans after Monday? Did anyone receive contact that was never publicly confirmed? Each question requires records, interviews, and verification. Some answers may have been known to investigators but not released. This, too, is part of reading responsibly. A public case file is not the entire police file. Certain details stay withheld for good reasons. They may be used to test future information, protect privacy, or avoid harming people connected to the case. You accept the boundaries of what is known, because respecting them is part of patient work. The public absence of an answer can make a case feel more mysterious than the private file may be. But it can also mean the private file truly contains no final proof. We cannot know everything investigators knew. We can know that Ruth remained missing, that police kept the case open, and that no public resolution emerged. Those facts are enough to keep us careful. Years later, when appeals returned to the media, the tone had changed. Ruth was no longer only recently missing. She was a young woman who would have been an adult, then older still, while the photograph stayed the same. You can feel how strange that is for those who loved her. To imagine her aging requires hope and imagination. To look at the old photograph requires grief and memory. Age progression can sometimes be used in missing person cases, though public memory often remains attached to the original image. Investigators may ask what Ruth would look like later, how her face might change, whether a sighting of an adult woman could be compared with a teenage photograph. This is delicate work. Faces change, but small features remain. Recognition becomes both possible and uncertain. The Ruth Wilson case has the added difficulty that, if she did choose to leave, she may have wanted not to be found. That possibility must be handled respectfully. Adults who disappeared as teenagers sometimes have complex reasons for remaining apart from family or public attention. But because Ruth was 16 when she vanished, and because no confirmed contact has closed the matter, the duty to know she is safe remains. You can feel the ethical tension there. A missing person has privacy, but a missing child also has vulnerability. Police must navigate both. If Ruth were found alive and did not wish her location shared, the public might not learn details, but authorities could confirm safety. The fact that no such confirmation has been announced leaves the file in its old, unresolved posture. That posture shapes every later investigation. You are never only asking what happened in 1995. You are also asking what has happened since. Has Ruth used official records under her own name? Has she appeared in employment systems, medical records, travel records, or other databases? Public information does not give us those answers, but investigators would know the importance of such checks, where lawful and possible. In earlier decades, changing identity was harder in some ways and easier in others. Fewer digital footprints meant fewer automatic traces, but everyday life still required documents, money, housing, work, and trust. A teenager starting over would likely need help. That help could come from a friend, an adult, a stranger, or a network no one around her knew. Each possibility opens another corridor in the file. You can imagine cold case officers drawing timelines, not only for Monday, but for the weeks before it. When did Ruth learn the full truth about her mother? Who did she tell? What did she ask? Did she withdraw money? Did she give things away? Did she seem to say goodbye? Did she make plans beyond Monday? The work is not dramatic. It is careful accumulation. The week before a disappearance can sometimes glow with meaning afterward, but investigators must be cautious with hindsight. A person giving away an item may be clearing space, being generous, or signaling departure. A person paying for a meal may simply have money that night. A person ordering flowers may be making amends, showing kindness, or setting a marker for a later date. The file does not let you make one gesture carry every answer. You can sit with the florist again because it remains so human. A young woman stands among flowers and chooses something for the woman who helped raise her. She sets a delivery date after the day she will vanish. She leaves the shop and the order proceeds as ordinary commerce, even while everything else changes. The quietness of that sequence is what makes it so difficult to place. For the florist, the memory may have become sharper after police came asking, what did she choose? What did she say? Did she seem upset? Was she alone? How did she pay? Did she mention anything about the delivery? You can imagine the counter, the damp stems, the handwriting in a book, and the sudden realization that an ordinary customer interaction had become part of a missing person investigation. This is how cases enter the lives of witnesses. A taxi fare, a shop order, a library visit, a glimpse on a hill. Most witnesses did not know they were witnessing anything. They were simply present in the ordinary world around Ruth's final confirmed day. Later, investigators asked them to retrieve those moments from memory, and the moments became evidence. There is humility in depending on ordinary people this way. A detective may have training, but the case belongs partly to the community that saw fragments of it. Dorking and the villagers around Box Hill held pieces of the timeline, not all at once, and not always clearly. The investigation had to gather those pieces without damaging them through pressure or assumption. The file may have included maps marked with pins or circles, though you only need to imagine the practical gesture. Dorking High Street, the library, the railway station, the road to Box Hill, the drop-off near the Bridleway, Betchworth Quarry, a series of places close enough to travel in a day, each with its own smell, sound, and weather. Together they form the known world of the case. Walking that route in your mind, you notice the pauses. Time in the library, time before the taxi, time on the hill after the taxi left. Pauses are where intention hides and where witnesses become scarce. A person in motion may be seen. A person waiting may blend into the background. A person alone may leave nothing but the fact that they were once there. The investigation, then, was partly an attempt to make the pauses speak. Did Ruth meet anyone during the library hours? Did she use a public phone? Did she write the notes there or elsewhere? Did she have the flowers arranged before or after deciding to go to Box Hill? Did she eat? Did she speak to anyone whose memory never reached police? These are quiet questions, and they remain quiet because the answers did not come plainly. You can hear the subdued rhythm of an incident room in the first weeks. Phones ringing, paper sliding from fax machines, officers updating boards, family liaison contacts being made, search coordinators checking maps. Then, over time, the room empties. The case does not end, but it changes volume. What was a daily noise becomes a recurring presence. A file opened when new information arrives. That change can be hard for families, because the public world appears to move on. Investigators may still care, but they must handle many cases. News cycles shorten. Search volunteers return to work and school. People stop mentioning the missing person every day, not because they have forgotten, but because life resumes its demands. For the family, the absence remains at the center of the room. The Ruth Wilson case stayed alive, partly because it contained unresolved public details and partly because her family continued to seek answers. Appeals over years made clear that the uncertainty itself was a burden. You can feel that in any long missing person case. Not knowing prevents ordinary grieving, ordinary anger, ordinary relief. It leaves people rehearsing possibilities in the dark. A detective working such a case must be able to sit with families without offering false certainty. That is a skill rarely discussed. It is easier to promise than to be patient. It is easier to say we will find out than to say we will keep trying. The second sentence is quieter and perhaps more honest. In the Ruth Wilson case, keeping trying became the long shape of the work. You turn the page again, and the paper makes a small dry sound under your hand. There may be statements from searchers, appeal logs, press cuttings, and review notes, all arranged by date. Some pages matter more than others, but the investigator cannot always know which until later. A minor detail in one year may connect to a report in another. That is why files are kept. Cold case patience is partly archival patience. You preserve what you cannot yet interpret. You label it. You store it. You make it possible for someone later to read it with fresh eyes. The value of that work may not appear for decades. In solved historical cases, the breakthrough often seems sudden from the outside, but inside the file, it rests on years of preservation. The Ruth Wilson case has not had that kind of public breakthrough. Yet, the same principle applies. Every statement, every photograph, every item, every appeal response was part of a structure that might one day matter. Investigators do not know which piece will unlock a case, so they must keep the pieces in order, even when the answer does not come. You can imagine a later reviewer reading the original taxi driver statement and then checking it against a map. How far from the drop-off to the quarry? How long would it take in rain? What could be seen from the road? Was there shelter? Were there houses nearby? Could another vehicle stop without drawing attention? The questions repeat, but repetition is not failure. It is how uncertainty is tested. A later reviewer might also return to the anniversary footage. They might ask whether the original tape still exists, whether it was enhanced, whether the person was identified, whether the shopkeeper's account was fully explored. Old video has its own fragility. Tapes degrade. Copies lose clarity. Machines become obsolete. The physical survival of evidence becomes part of the investigation. You can smell that old video room if you try. Warm plastic, dust from equipment vents, the faint electric scent of monitors left on too long. Someone pauses a frame and leans closer. The face on the screen remains uncertain. The desire for recognition is strong, but pixels do not soften out of kindness. They show what they show, and no more. The investigators would also have considered whether Ruth's name appeared in official systems after her disappearance. Public reports do not give us the details, and we do not need them. It is enough to understand the method. A living person leaves traces, unless she is helped carefully or remains outside normal records. A dead person may leave no trace if no remains are found. Both possibilities are heavy in different ways. The case also asks about secrecy. Could someone have known where Ruth went and chosen not to speak? Could someone have helped her leave and kept confidence for years? Could a witness have seen something and dismissed it as unimportant? Silence in old cases is not always malicious. Sometimes it is loyalty, sometimes shame, sometimes simply the failure to recognize importance until too late. Appeals in long cases often speak to that very person, the one who knows a small thing. You may have thought it did not matter. You may have been young. You may have been protecting someone. You may have seen Ruth after she disappeared and never reported it. The language has to be calm, because the goal is not to accuse. The goal is to invite information into the light. In the Ruth Wilson case, that invitation has remained open. It belongs to Surrey Police, to missing person charities, to the family's appeals, and to the public memory of a girl last seen on Box Hill. You can feel the quiet persistence of it, like a lamp left on in a front room, not bright enough to disturb the night, but bright enough to say someone is still waiting. When the file turns back toward Ruth herself, the most respectful thing we can do is resist making her only a puzzle. She may have been struggling. She may also have been capable, thoughtful, angry, kind, private, and ordinary, in ways no public account can fully hold. You remember the music shop, the church bells, the meals with friends, the library chair, the flowers. These details are not decorations. They are reminders of personhood. A disappearance can flatten someone into the day they vanished. Investigation tries, imperfectly, to do the opposite. It gathers the days before. It asks who she was when she laughed, what she liked, where she went, whom she trusted. It does this not out of sentimentality, but because understanding a person's life may help explain where they went, and because truth requires context. You can almost hear a detective asking a friend, "What music did Ruth like?" It sounds irrelevant until it is not. A song can connect to a place, a person, a plan, a mood. A music shop job can reveal acquaintances. A cassette in a bag can show what someone wanted near them that day. Small preferences can become investigative paths when a person leaves few other traces. The file's era matters here too. In 1995, music was carried physically. Tapes had labels. Personal stereos needed batteries. If Ruth had one with her, it suggests something about the day's expected length, or simply her habits. You can feel the object in your hand, its plastic edges, the slight click when a cassette door closes, the private world of sound it offered to a teenager moving through town. Private worlds are hard for investigators. They can speak to friends and family, but they cannot fully enter the interior life of the missing person. They infer from behavior, writings, purchases, choices, and conversations. The risk is always over-reading. The duty is still to read. You hold that tension gently, because it is present in almost every page. Ruth's search for information about her mother may have been one such private world. It may have shaped how she understood herself, her family, and the home she lived in. It may have deepened distress. It may have created a desire to confront, leave, mourn, or simply be alone. We do not know which, and saying we do not know is part of staying truthful. The police had to decide how much weight to place on the notes near the quarry in relation to that emotional history. They had to consider whether the notes reflected a final intention, a temporary state, or something more complicated. They had to consider whether someone could have staged or altered anything, although public information has not established that. The responsible position remains careful, neither dismissing nor overstating. You can imagine the forensic handling of paper, even in a case that remains mostly known through narrative. Paper can hold handwriting, fingerprints, fibers, moisture, and context. It can also be damaged by weather. A note found outdoors may not preserve everything investigators wish it would. The texture of it, the dampness, the way ink has run or held, all become small facts. The bottle and packets would have been considered in similar practical terms. Were they linked to Ruth? Where were they purchased? Could anyone trace them? Were there fingerprints or other marks? Did their location match the notes? Each question sounds simple, but each requires work, and each may return an answer too partial to settle the case. Evidence does not always speak loudly enough. When searchers did not find Ruth near those items, the inquiry could not stop there. Searchers may miss things, especially in difficult terrain, but repeated absence pushes investigators to widen their thinking. Perhaps she left the area. Perhaps the items did not mark the final location. Perhaps the search conditions mattered. The file keeps all that in motion because the ground did not give a final response. You can feel the emotional strain of that for search teams as well. People who volunteer or work in searches carry the landscape afterward. A path becomes remembered. A hedge becomes familiar. A quarry edge becomes a place where they looked and found nothing. The body remembers cold fingers, damp boots, and the tired silence after a day outside. Investigation is not only paperwork, it is physical labor in weather. The Ruth Wilson case settled into Surrey's local memory, attached especially to Box Hill. For some, the place remains a beauty spot. For others, it carries the knowledge of the last confirmed sighting. Places can hold more than one meaning at once. Families picnic where others searched. Walkers admire views where detectives once measured possibilities. The hill goes on being a hill, even while the file keeps returning to it. As you sit with the case tonight, you can let that dual nature remain. There is no need to make Box Hill ominous. It was and is a real place, with trees, paths, visitors, dogs, rain, wind, chalk, and views across the Surrey landscape. The mystery does not erase the ordinary beauty of it. It simply adds a quiet question to one part of its history. That question was carried by officers, who may now have retired, by family members who aged through the waiting, and by friends who grew into adult lives with Ruth still missing. Cold cases pass from one person's desk to another. A name written by one hand is later read by another. The chain is imperfect, but it matters. Continuity is one of the forms patience takes. You can imagine a new investigator opening the file years later, perhaps younger than the case itself, and feeling the odd closeness of old records. The clothes, the taxi fare, the school day, the shop names, the old technology. Some details feel distant, others feel immediate. A missing teenager does not become less important because time has passed. The question remains as present as the first page. Working an old case also means confronting what cannot be changed. The first hours cannot be redone. Witnesses cannot be made younger. Weather cannot be measured again exactly. Lost materials may stay lost. Yet the investigator is not powerless. They can organize, Compare, appeal, test, listen, and keep the file alive. Patient work is the refusal to confuse difficulty with impossibility. In the Ruth Wilson case, one of the recurring difficulties is that several explanations can absorb the known facts without proving themselves. Voluntary disappearance can account for planning and no body. Suicide can account for the notes and emotional context, but is unsettled by the absence of remains. Accident can account for a missing body in difficult terrain, though the notes complicate that. Third-party involvement can explain silence, but public evidence has not established it. The case stays open between them. You do not need to rank these possibilities tonight. The detective's chair you occupy is not a courtroom. It is a quiet place of review. You can let each possibility rest on the table, like separate folders, and notice which facts belong in more than one folder. That is often how unresolved cases feel. The same detail can point down more than one path. The flowers point toward intentionality, but not what kind. The library points toward waiting, but not for whom or what. The taxi points toward Box Hill, but not beyond it. The notes point toward distress, but not the final outcome. The CCTV points toward possible life, but not certainty. Each item keeps its own small gravity. This is why the investigation could not be rushed into a neat shape. A neat shape would comfort the storyteller more than the case. Patient detectives are trained, or learn through disappointment, that comfort is not evidence. They let the unanswered remain unanswered until something real changes it. You can feel the patience of that, deep and plain, in every renewed appeal. The human element of the Ruth Wilson case is not only grief, it is also endurance. Families endure not knowing. Investigators endure incomplete evidence. Witnesses endure the return of old memories. Communities endure a question attached to a familiar place. Even listeners, years later, sit with the fact that some stories do not offer the usual ease of resolution, but endurance does not have to be loud. It can be a file kept in order, a photograph preserved, a phone number left active for information, a detective taking one more call seriously, a friend mentioning Ruth's name after many years, so she is not folded entirely into silence. These are small acts, but small acts are often what old cases are made of. You can rest your eyes, if they are heavy, while the file remains open in the lamplight. The details will wait. Dorking High Street will wait. The library will wait. Box Hill, in the mind, will wait in its grey November weather. We are not solving the Ruth Wilson case tonight by force. We are staying with it carefully, the way careful people stayed with it across the years. And as the next set of pages comes forward, the focus shifts again from the first days of searching to the longer pattern of appeals, sightings, and the quiet ways an unresolved case keeps asking the same patient question. The longer pattern of appeals begins quietly, not with a dramatic new path, but with the same name being spoken again into rooms where someone might remember. Ruth Wilson, Dorking, Box Hill, the 27th of November, 1995. You can imagine the words moving from a police press office to a newspaper desk, then into kitchens, buses, shops, and small conversations between people who had lived nearby and wondered whether they had missed something. Appeals are a particular kind of listening. They seem, from the outside, to be statements, but their real purpose is to invite an answer. Someone reads, someone pauses, someone thinks of a face on a station platform or a girl near a road in rain. Most of these thoughts lead nowhere certain, but investigators cannot know that until they ask. So the file grows, one possible memory at a time. In the Ruth Wilson case, each appeal carried the same gentle contradiction. Police needed the public to think carefully, but they could not ask the public to imagine too much. A useful memory has edges. It has a place, a time, a reason, the witness noticed. A less useful memory may be sincere, but blurred by the missing photograph, by the ache of the case, or by the natural human wish to help. You can picture an officer taking an appeal response over the telephone. The room is ordinary, perhaps a desk with a mug ring on the surface, a stack of messages waiting, and the low murmur of other calls nearby. The witness says, "I think I saw her." The officer asks, "Where were you? What day was it? How close were you? What was she wearing?" The questions are plain, because plain questions protect the truth. Some sightings would have been quickly ruled out. Others would have taken more work. A person might resemble Ruth, but be too old, too tall, or known locally. A date might not fit. A location might be impossible. Yet every dismissed sighting still costs time, and every unconfirmed sighting leaves a slight trace in the file. You turn those pages slowly, aware that patience can be made of many disappointments. The Dorking newsagent footage remained one of the more memorable reported sightings because it appeared so close to the anniversary. You return to it not as a solution, but as an example of how an unresolved case can brighten suddenly, then dim again. The girl asked for local papers. One had sold out. She was said to have become upset. The footage was saved because the shopkeeper understood it might matter. Imagine the shop in late afternoon or early evening, if that is when your mind places it, with papers stacked by the door and the smell of ink, sweets, and raincoats. The fluorescent lighting would flatten colors. The camera would sit high and impersonal. A person would enter, speak briefly, and leave. Later, under a different light, those few seconds would be watched again and again, carrying more meaning than any ordinary errand can bear. For investigators, the question was not only whether the girl looked like Ruth, it was whether the behavior, the timing, and the location made sense together. A resemblance by itself is fragile. A resemblance on the anniversary, asking for local papers, becomes harder to ignore. But harder to ignore is not the same as proven. You keep that distinction close, like a bookmark between hope and evidence. Ruth's parents believed the girl was their daughter. That belief deserves to be treated with tenderness. Parents know a face in ways strangers do not. The set of shoulders, the way someone stands, the tilt of the head. Yet grief can also sharpen recognition until it aches. Investigators had to respect the family's certainty while still asking whether the image could be verified by other means. The footage did not close the case. That is the important, quiet fact. If it was Ruth, it suggested she was alive a year later and still connected, at least emotionally, to the local reports. If it was not Ruth, it showed how strongly the case had entered the mind of the community, so that a resemblance in a shop could reopen the whole question. Either way, the file remained open. You can imagine the tape being placed into evidence, labeled, logged, and stored. Old video evidence has a physical vulnerability that digital files often hide. It can stretch, degrade, or become difficult to play when machines vanish from use. A reviewer years later may need equipment that itself feels archival, with buttons that click and a screen glow that belongs to another time. Even technology grows old inside a cold case. This aging of materials changes the feel of the investigation. The first search smelled of wet leaves and mud. The later review smells of warmed plastic, paper dust, and old envelopes. A detective no longer stands only in rain on Box Hill, but also at a desk under office light, trying to coax clarity from records made in a different world. You sit beside that desk now, reading over a shoulder that may belong to more than one generation of officer. The Ruth Wilson case also received attention because it resisted the simplest categories. A voluntary disappearance remained possible, but without confirmed contact. A death on or near Box Hill remained possible, but without remains. A meeting with someone else remained possible, but without confirmed contact. The missed school day, the taxis, the florist, the library, the final journey to Box Hill, and the notes near the quarry all suggest deliberation of some kind. But deliberation is not destination. You can plan a day without knowing where it will end. A young person may plan to be alone for a while. She may plan to frighten family members into understanding her hurt. She may plan to leave and then hesitate. She may plan something final and then change her mind. She may plan to meet someone, trusted or untested. Investigators had to allow for the movement of a human mind, especially a young one under emotional strain. The case asks us to be careful with Ruth's age. At 16, a person can be thoughtful, organized, and determined. At 16, a person can also be vulnerable to sudden feeling, to persuasion, to secrecy, to the heavy force of a truth recently learned. You do not need to choose one version of adolescence over another. The file requires both. Ruth may have had agency and still needed protection. This is why the language of investigation matters. To say she left voluntarily might be true in one sense, if she chose the taxi and chose the hill. But voluntary does not answer what happened later. It does not tell us whether she remained safe, whether someone met her, whether she changed her mind, or whether she was able to return. A careful investigator uses the word only as far as evidence allows. The same care applies to the word suicide. The notes and emotional context meant that possibility had to be taken seriously. But in the Ruth Wilson case, the absence of a body, the possible sightings, and the unresolved physical evidence meant it could not be made into a public certainty. We can acknowledge distress without declaring an ending that was never confirmed. That restraint is not evasive, it is respectful. You may feel the quiet pressure of the unsolved as you read, especially when several explanations seem to lean toward the same place and then stop. This is the texture of many cold cases. The strongest theory may still be incomplete. The most compassionate theory may not be the most accurate. The most unsettling theory may not be supported. Patient work means carrying that pressure without letting it rush you. The investigators would have built timelines not only of Ruth's last day, but of the days and weeks around it. You can imagine pages ruled into columns, times written down, names matched to statements. Saturday at the music shop, Saturday meal with Will and Neil, Sunday handbells, Sunday youth group, Sunday supper, Monday taxi, Monday florist, Monday library, Monday taxi, Monday Box Hill. Then the empty space. That empty space is where review teams spend so much time. They ask whether any unreported event could fill it. A second vehicle, a walker, a call from a public phone, a person waiting in a lay-by, a path taken toward another road, a shelter used briefly, a bus connection, a lift from someone known. In a rural or semi-rural place, movement can be both visible and invisible, depending on the minute. You can stand, in your mind, near the drop-off point and listen. A road sound fades. Rain ticks against leaves. Somewhere, a gate may close, or a dog may bark. The air smells of wet earth and damp bark. If Ruth was waiting for someone, she may have watched the road. If she was walking, she may have looked for a path. If she was uncertain, she may have stood still long enough for the taxi driver's memory to catch her. That memory is so small, and yet it endures. A girl standing in rain. It is one of the case's central images because it belongs to the last known moment. But it is still only a moment. It does not contain the whole truth. A detective must prevent a final image from becoming a final answer. You keep reminding yourself of that, gently, each time the scene returns. The search that followed was shaped by urgency and by the landscape. Officers and volunteers looked where the last sighting suggested they should look. Dogs were brought in. A helicopter searched from above. Thermal equipment was used. The quarry area received attention. Searchers entered the same damp world Ruth had entered, but with torches, radios, lines of command, and the heavy knowledge that time mattered. You can picture a volunteer after hours outside, gloves damp, legs tired, hearing the scrape of branches against waterproof fabric. Searching is not always high emotion. Often it is method. Look here, mark it, move there, check again. Speak if you find something. Keep your footing. The mind may wander, then return sharply to a patch of ground or a scrap caught in bramble. Searches are acts of care as much as procedure. People give their bodies to the question. They walk through cold weather because a missing person is not an abstraction to them. In the Ruth Wilson case, school friends and local people were among those connected to search efforts, and that must have carried its own quiet weight. To search for someone you know is to move through the landscape with memory beside you. The search did not bring Ruth home. That plain fact sits heavily, but not loudly. It meant investigators had to widen their understanding beyond the immediate ground. It meant sightings had to be pursued. It meant family history had to be examined. It meant the notes had to be interpreted carefully. It meant, most of all, that the inquiry had to continue without the one answer searchers most wanted. As weeks turned into months, the case would have become less about immediate rescue and more about sustained inquiry. That change is one of the hardest transitions in missing person work. The first days carry action. Later days require endurance. Phones still ring, but less often. New information arrives, but not in a steady stream. The file grows more slowly, and the waiting begins to define the work. You can imagine the family liaison side of this. Someone had to communicate with Ruth's family, explain what had been done, what was being checked, and what could not yet be said. Such conversations require plainness without brutality, hope without false promise, professional distance without coldness. A kettle may boil in the background, a chair may creak. People may ask the same question more than once, because the heart does not accept information as quickly as the ear receives it. The Ruth Wilson case also placed emotional pressure on those who may have felt they knew something but not enough. Friends might ask themselves whether a conversation had been a warning. A shopkeeper might replay a tone of voice. A taxi driver might remember the last glance in the mirror. These burdens can settle quietly on ordinary people, and investigators must sometimes collect their memories without adding unnecessary guilt. Memory, again, is fragile. After a disappearance, people search backward for signs. They may find real ones. They may also assign meaning to gestures that were ordinary at the time. A friend's quietness becomes ominous. A paid meal becomes symbolic. A gift of clothing becomes preparation. The file has to receive these impressions, then test them gently against what can be known. You can feel how patient the detective must be in those interviews. Let the witness speak. Ask for sensory detail. What did the room look like? What was the weather? Who else was there? Did Ruth seem tired? Was she carrying a bag? Did she mention Monday? Sometimes the body remembers what the conscious mind does not. The coldness of a day, the smell of a cafe, the exact seat someone chose. In the Ruth Wilson case, one detail that often recurs is the small blue duffel bag. A bag is a practical object, but in a disappearance it becomes a question. What was inside? Was it enough for a short outing or something longer? Did anyone see her with it at each stage? Was it found, lost, hidden, or carried onward? You can feel the fabric in your hand, worn at the handles, smelling faintly of clothes or damp pavement. If Ruth carried a personal stereo and tapes, those objects make the day feel even more personal. Music can be company when a person is alone. It can also be a shield. You can imagine headphones tucked away, a cassette case rattling softly in a bag, the private soundscape of a teenager moving through a town where no one yet knows she is disappearing. Investigators would note such things because they belong to habit and intention. The inquiry had to consider money too. Travel and disappearance require resources, even modest ones. How much cash did Ruth have? Did she withdraw any? Did she pay for taxis? And flowers from her own money? Could she have bought a train ticket? Could she have stayed somewhere? Public accounts do not give every answer, but the questions show the method. Practicalities shape possibility. In a cold case, practical questions are grounding. They keep the mind from floating too far into story. A new life requires shelter, food, documents, money, and secrecy. An accident requires a location and mechanism that searchers missed. A third party requires contact, opportunity, and silence. A self-directed death requires a place and circumstances that fit the evidence. Each possibility must pass through practical reality. You sit with the case long enough, and you begin to understand why it has remained so difficult. It is not empty. It is not chaotic. It is not without evidence. It has many meaningful details, but they do not connect into a confirmed final sequence. That can be more haunting than a case with almost nothing, because every known fact seems to lean toward the missing answer without reaching it. The appeals over time became a way of pressing gently on that missing answer. On anniversaries, police and family would ask again for information. Media would retell the timeline. Ruth's photograph would appear. Box Hill would be named. The florist, the library, the taxi, the notes, and the possible sightings would return. Each retelling risked repetition, but repetition is sometimes necessary when the right listener may only hear it years later. You can imagine someone hearing an appeal after many years and suddenly remembering a conversation from 1995. Perhaps they thought it was irrelevant. Perhaps they had moved away. Perhaps they did not follow the news at the time. The human archive is not neatly indexed. Memories surface when touched by a name, a place, a photograph, a season. This is why old appeals still matter. There is also the possibility that someone withheld information deliberately. A calm appeal must make space for that too. Circumstances change, relationships end, loyalties weaken, fear fades. A person who could not speak at 16 may speak at 40. A person who protected someone may decide the protection no longer matters. Cold case investigators know that time can erode silence as well as memory. In the Ruth Wilson case, if someone did help her leave, that person may now carry a long private burden. If someone saw her after Box Hill and never reported it, they may have lived for years with uncertainty about whether it mattered. If someone knows that a sighting was false or true, they may still be able to clarify a piece of the file. The door remains open to small truths, not only large confessions. You turn another page, and it feels like the file moves from public appeal back to the landscape again, because Box Hill always draws it home. To visit Box Hill after reading the Ruth Wilson case would be to see an ordinary place with a second layer. The paths do not announce the mystery. Trees grow, leaves fall, walkers pass, and the views stretch outward in their usual calm. Yet if you know the file, certain names on the map feel charged with quiet attention. The drop-off, the bridleway, Betchworth Quarry, the road where the taxi moved away, a detective returning there years later, might bring old photographs, maps, and statements. The landscape may have changed. Fences move. Vegetation thickens or clears. Buildings change names. Paths become more maintained or less used. But the broad geography remains. You can compare the old account to the present ground, not expecting the hill to speak, but allowing it to remind you of distance, visibility, and time. Ground truth matters. Files can make distances feel abstract. A map can shrink a tiring walk into an inch. Standing there, you feel slopes in your legs, weather on your face, and the way a bend in the road can hide someone quickly. The smell of wet chalk and leaf mold may tell you more about the day's practical conditions than a line in a report. Investigators know this, which is why revisiting locations can matter. On the day Ruth vanished, late afternoon would have been closing down toward early darkness. In November, especially under rain, the world can seem to dim before you are ready. That would affect witnesses. People hurry to cars. Walkers turn home. Drivers focus on wipers and headlights. A person standing still near a road might be noticed briefly, then swallowed by weather and routine. You can feel why the taxi driver's memory was both valuable and limited. He saw Ruth at the edge of the unknown, but his task was to drive away. He was not watching for a missing person. He could not know that the moment mattered. Later, he gave investigators what he had: a location, a time, an impression. In many cases, that is all the last witness can offer. The phrase "last confirmed sighting" is formal, but it carries human weight. It does not mean last sighting with certainty in life. It means the last moment investigators could publicly anchor. Other people may have seen Ruth later. The CCTV may have shown her. A private sighting may exist in the file, but confirmed sighting is a careful category, and in this case, it points to Box Hill in the rain. You can sit with that care for a while. Words like confirmed, reported, believed, possible, and alleged are not decoration. They are the hinges of responsible investigation. A confirmed fact can bear weight. A reported fact must be tested. A belief can guide inquiry, but not replace proof. The Ruth Wilson case requires this kind of language because so much is close to known and not quite there. The search of the quarry area illustrates the same point. Items were reportedly found near the top edge, but Ruth herself was not. That fact neither proves nor disproves the most painful possibilities. It means investigators searched, found some things, and did not find others. The absence had to be interpreted in context, not turned into certainty. You can feel the discipline of that in the cold air around the quarry. Betchworth Quarry itself is a place of texture. Chalky ground, exposed faces, scrub, uneven tracks, and the pale color of stone after rain. Sound can carry strangely. A footstep may slide. Leaves gather in pockets. To search such a place is to be physically careful and mentally focused. A dropped object may be obvious in one light and invisible in another. The ground teaches humility. Search dogs bring another form of uncertainty. They are skilled, but they are not magic. Weather, time, scent conditions, terrain, and prior movement all affect what they can detect. A helicopter sees from above, but trees and uneven ground interrupt sight. Thermal equipment can help, but only under certain conditions. The early search used serious resources, yet serious resources do not guarantee a finding. This matters because old cases often attract the question, how could nothing be found? Sometimes the answer is that the world is larger, rougher, and less observable than we want it to be. Sometimes the answer is that the missing person was no longer there. Sometimes both possibilities remain. Investigators in the Ruth Wilson case had to accept that an extensive search could still leave the central question unresolved. The quiet cruelty of such searches is that they may prove effort without proving outcome. Everyone can work hard. Everyone can do the reasonable things. The file can show diligence, coordination, and commitment, and still, at the end of the day, the person is missing. You can feel how this shapes the emotional life of a case. Work and answer are not always joined. As the years passed, Ruth's name appeared in renewed discussions of missing people who seemed to vanish by choice or circumstance. Comparisons can help the public understand, but they can also flatten the case. Every disappearance has its own geography, family history, timing, and evidence. The Ruth Wilson case cannot be solved by resemblance to another mystery. It has to be read on its own terms. You read those terms slowly. A teenage girl from Betchworth. A painful truth about her mother. A Monday in late November. A florist on Dorking High Street. A library visit. A taxi to Box Hill. Notes and items near a quarry. Searches that found no final answer. Possible sightings, including the Dorking newsagent footage. Years of appeals. An open case. Each term matters, but none alone is enough. There is a strange kindness in taking time with each fact. It prevents the case from becoming only its most famous details. The flowers are important, but so is the library. The hill is important, but so is the music shop. The notes are important, but so are the people who last shared ordinary meals with Ruth. A life is not built from clues alone. It is built from days. Detective work, at its most patient, knows this. It reads school attendance not as bureaucracy, but as a sign that something unusual happened. It reads a taxi receipt as a moment of choice. It reads a friend's memory as both evidence and human offering. It reads silence not as emptiness, but as a place where more work may be needed. You sit beside that practice, quietly learning its pace. The pace is slow enough for doubt. That is important. Doubt can be frustrating, but it keeps the investigation honest. A detective may doubt an appealing theory, doubt a witness's certainty, doubt an old assumption, doubt a dismissed lead, or doubt their own first impression. In a case like Ruth Wilson's, doubt is not failure. It is a tool, used gently. You might imagine a review meeting years later. Several people sit around a table with copies of the timeline. The chairs are practical. The coffee is not very good. Rain taps against a window, or perhaps sunlight falls across the older pages. Someone raises the possibility of voluntary disappearance. Someone else notes the notes near the quarry. Another mentions the lack of remains. Another asks about later sightings. The room does not choose too quickly. This kind of meeting can feel unsatisfying because it produces actions, not answers. Recontact this witness. Check that record. Revisit this location. Confirm whether this item still exists. Prepare a renewed appeal. Compare old sightings. Each action is modest, but modest actions are how old cases avoid becoming myths. They keep the investigation attached to the ground. In the Ruth Wilson case, the ground includes family relationships that were painful and complicated. It would be easy for outsiders to judge from fragments, but patient inquiry resists that. Families often contain secrets born from fear or misguided protection. Teenagers often respond to those secrets in ways adults cannot predict. A disappearance forces everyone into public examination, whether or not they were prepared for it. You can hold compassion for Ruth and for those around her without flattening the facts. Compassion does not mean avoiding difficult questions. It means asking them without cruelty. Why was the truth about Nesta's death hidden? How did Ruth learn it? What did she say afterward? Who understood her distress? Did anyone see Monday coming? These questions matter, but they do not require harshness. The investigators may have had to speak more than once with Ruth's father and stepmother, with friends, with school contacts, and with people connected to church activities. Each conversation might reveal a small new angle, or only repeat what was already known. Repetition is part of witness work. People remember differently in different rooms. They may add details when trust grows. They may correct themselves when they have slept on it. You can picture those rooms. A school office with paper notices pinned to a board. A church hall smelling faintly of polish and old hymn books. A family kitchen with cups set down and untouched. A police interview room with a tape machine or notebook on the table. The settings are ordinary, but the subject makes the air feel careful. The handbell practice detail gives one of the gentlest sensory images in the file. Bells held in gloved hands, a bright controlled tone, the concentration of a small group making music together. On Sunday, this was just an activity. After Monday, it became part of the last known weekend. Investigators would ask who was there, what Ruth seemed like, whether she said anything unusual. The sound lingers because it belongs to life before absence. The youth group in Dorking adds another circle of people who might have noticed something. Young people talking, moving between rooms, perhaps laughing, perhaps only passing through the ordinary patterns of Sunday evening. You can almost smell squash in plastic cups, coats piled on chairs, damp shoes on a hall floor. These are not dramatic scenes. Their value lies in normality, because a change in normality may be the only sign available. At supper with Will Kennedy's family, Ruth received old clothing. That gesture may have been no more than a mother offering useful things to a teenager she knew. It may have taken on significance only later. Investigators would ask whether Ruth requested the clothing, whether she seemed eager for it, whether she took it away, and whether any of it was later found or missing. Again, practicality guides the questions. Will and Neil, as friends who saw her shortly before Monday, would have been important witnesses. Not suspects by that fact, but witnesses to mood, plans, words, and behavior. People close to a missing person often become repositories of small clues. They may not know they hold them. A joke, a complaint, a mention of Box Hill, a comment about home, or an interest in travel could become meaningful later. The Saturday meal, with Ruth paying, remains one of those small acts people have wondered about. You consider it carefully. Paying for a meal can be generosity. It can be celebration. It can be a goodbye. It can be a coincidence. The file does not allow us to know from that detail alone. A detective notes it, asks around it, and then resists letting it carry more than it can. This restraint is part of the sleep of the script too, if you let it be. We are not here to force a solution into the dark. We are here to move slowly through the case, as investigators had to, feeling the edges of each fact. The lamp stays low, the pages turn quietly, your breathing can remain even, because nothing in this room requires sudden certainty. The public has often been drawn to whether Ruth might have survived and created another life. There are cases where missing young people did leave, where they made painful separations permanent, where they built identities elsewhere. That possibility can feel hopeful. It can also feel difficult, because if true, it means Ruth chose or felt compelled not to return, not to confirm safety, not to step back into the life that searched for her. Investigators would examine that possibility through records and reports. Did anyone use Ruth's name? Did anyone matching her description appear elsewhere? Did official systems catch a trace? Did someone claim to know her under another identity? The public hears only parts of this work, but the method is clear. A living lead must be followed as carefully as a physical one. Sightings at a distance can be especially difficult. A person spotted in another town, another county, or another country may resemble the missing person, and the witness may be sincere. But travel, age, clothing, accent, companions, and timing all have to be checked. Sometimes the person is found and identified as someone else, sometimes not. Unresolved sightings can sit in a file like stones at the bottom of water. The Ruth Wilson case appears to have had sightings that police considered worth following, though none publicly closed the inquiry. That phrase, worth following, carries the quiet labor of travel, phone calls, comparisons, and waiting for replies. It is easy to forget that each possible sighting produces a small investigation of its own. A missing person case is often many investigations braided together. You may imagine a detective driving to speak to a witness years after the original disappearance. The car heater hums. Road signs pass. A folder sits on the passenger seat. The witness may be nervous, apologetic, or unexpectedly firm. They saw someone. They remember because of the hair, the expression, the date, or the local newspaper. The detective listens, asks, notes, and later compares. Afterward, the report joins the file. It may be marked for follow-up, discounted, or left unresolved. No single sighting is allowed to become the whole case unless it can bear that weight. This is slow work, and it can feel unrewarding, but it is also how possibility is treated with respect. You do not know which small report may one day align with another. The Ruth Wilson case remained in the public mind partly because it contains the possibility of return. Not return in a dramatic sense, just contact, a message, a confirmation, a small official assurance that she is safe. For families of long-term missing people, that small assurance would be enormous. It would not answer every emotional question, but it would end the fear that something unknown happened and was never discovered. No confirmed assurance has been made public, so the appeals continue to matter. They speak to Ruth if she is alive. They speak to anyone who knew her after the 27th of November. They speak to anyone who saw her that day. They speak to anyone who thinks an old memory is too small. In patient detective work, very little is too small before it is examined. There is a tenderness in that idea. A small memory may be the one thing a person can give. The color of a bag, the direction someone walked, the sound of a name spoken in a cafe, a girl asking about local newspapers, a taxi waiting near a station, a person in a red jumper near a road. Each memory, if true, belongs somewhere. The investigator's job is to find where. As the file deepens, you begin to sense the difference between mystery and uncertainty. Mystery can become a kind of story people enjoy from a distance. Uncertainty is what families live with. The Ruth Wilson case should be held as uncertainty first. It is not a puzzle placed here for entertainment. It is a real absence patiently examined, because real people needed and still need answers. That approach changes the tone of every theory. You do not ask, which theory is most intriguing? You ask, which explanation best fits the evidence, and what would need to be true for it to be right? You ask what pain each possibility creates for those involved. You ask what information could still be found. This is detective work as care, not as performance. You can imagine an old detective, near retirement, looking again at the first page and not being able to forget the girl on the hill. Cases stay with people that way. They become associated with a season, a road, a photograph, a family's voice. Even when professional life moves on, certain names remain. Ruth Wilson is one of those names for many who have read or worked around the case. There may have been officers who thought one theory was most likely. There may have been others who favored another. That is normal in unresolved investigations. Experienced people can read the same facts and weigh them differently. The discipline is to keep the official position tied to what can be proven. Personal intuition may guide questions, but it cannot close a file. You sit with that distinction as the pages settle. Intuition is not useless. It can tell an investigator where to look again. But intuition must be tested by evidence, especially in a case carrying so much grief. A hunch can start a conversation. It cannot be the answer. The Ruth Wilson case deserves more than hunches, and the people who cared for her deserved more too. The phrase cold case can sound frozen, but this case is better imagined as a low ember. It does not flare every day. It does not dominate the news. Yet it remains warm enough that a new memory, a new document, or a new witness could still matter. You can see it in the repeated appeals and in the way the story returns whenever people speak of long missing teenagers and unresolved journeys. Ruth's age also means that, if alive, she would be much older now, living an adult life far beyond the photograph. That thought changes the emotional shape of the appeal. It asks not only where did the girl go, but who did she become if she lived? It asks whether she carried the name Ruth or another name. It asks whether she remembered Box Hill as an ending or as the beginning of something hidden. These questions are not for us to answer tonight. They are for the file, the investigators, and anyone who truly knows, but you can hold them without disturbing the calm of the room. The file is patient. The lamp is patient. The rain in your imagination keeps its steady rhythm. Some questions can be present without becoming sharp. When investigators address a long missing person directly in an appeal, they often choose words with great care. They may say that no one is in trouble. They may say the family only wants to know the person is safe. They may provide a confidential way to make contact. The language is designed to lower fear because fear can keep someone silent, even when years have passed. In the Ruth Wilson case, That possibility has always needed gentle handling. If she left because she felt hurt, betrayed, or unable to remain, then a public demand might not bring her forward. A quiet invitation might. If she is not alive, then the invitation still serves another purpose, reminding anyone with information that the case has not been forgotten. Either way, the open door remains part of the investigation. You can feel the passage of time in the objects. The red jumper would now belong to a style remembered from decades ago. The personal stereo feels historical. The taxi records may have existed on paper. The CCTV tape belongs to old machinery. Even the way people made phone calls has changed. Yet, the central human facts have not changed. A loved person disappeared. Others searched. The answer did not come. That continuity across changing technology is one reason the case stays affecting. It reminds us that even with new tools, investigation begins with attention. Look carefully, listen carefully, write accurately, preserve what you find, return when something changes. The methods evolve, but the ethical center remains the same. A missing person is owed patience. You may notice how often patience appears in this file as waiting, but it is more than waiting. It is disciplined return. It is choosing to open the old box again. It is refusing to let uncertainty become neglect. It is knowing that some families measure time not in years, but in anniversaries since the last confirmed sighting. The Ruth Wilson case has been measured that way for a very long time. Anniversaries are difficult in investigations. They renew attention, but they also reopen feeling. Reporters call. Police prepare statements. Families may be asked for interviews. The public hears the story again, perhaps for the first time. Information may come in. The day itself, the 27th of November, arrives with its own private weather, even if the sky is clear. For those close to Ruth, it is never just another date. A detective working an anniversary appeal has to balance respect and usefulness. Too much detail may overwhelm. Too little may fail to jog memory. The appeal must include the case name, the place, the clothing, the timeline, and the ways to provide information. It must be accurate enough to help, and humane enough not to feel like a spectacle. That balance is quiet work. The public may remember the most vivid details, but investigators also need the less vivid ones. Was there a parked car near the drop-off? Did anyone see a girl using a phone in Dorking? Did anyone notice someone waiting near Box Hill? Did anyone give a lift to a teenager in damp clothing? Did anyone find abandoned items after the searches? Small, unglamorous questions can be the ones that matter. You can imagine someone thinking, after an appeal, that their memory is too old. But old does not mean useless. It means it must be handled carefully. A witness can say what they remember, how sure they are, and why it stayed with them. Investigators can then decide its value. The burden of interpretation does not have to rest on the witness alone. In the Ruth Wilson case, a person who was a teenager then would now look back across a long span of adult life. Their memory of Ruth may be preserved in school corridors, music, church activities, or social gatherings. The smell of a youth hall, the sound of handbells, the texture of a school blazer, or the chatter outside a shop may bring back something specific. Memory often returns through the senses before it returns as words. That sensory quality is one reason old cases can be revived by revisiting places. A witness walking past the old florist site, or through Dorking High Street, or up on Box Hill, might suddenly remember a detail. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes. The body remembers roots, the ear remembers voices, the eye remembers colors. Investigators know that memory is not only stored in files. You, too, have been moving through those places tonight in your mind. The warm florist after the wet street, The library with its quiet shelves, the taxi with wipers moving, the road near the bridleway, the quarry with pale stone and damp scrub, the newsagent with old CCTV. Each place holds one section of the case, and together they make the investigation feel less abstract. The next part of the file, the one you can sense waiting under the current pages, belongs to the continuing question of what investigators could still do when the first searches were long over. It is not a sudden shift. It is the slow continuation of the same careful work, rechecking, reframing, listening again, returning to Ruth Wilson's name without forcing it into a conclusion, because the file is still asking to be read. And so the Ruth Wilson case rests where it has rested for so many years, not closed, not answered, and not forgotten. Ruth has never been found. No one has been charged in connection with her disappearance, and the case remains an open missing person inquiry, held in that difficult space where the known facts end and the quiet of Box Hill begins again. You can let that truth sit gently, without trying to press it into anything neater than it is. Some cases do not give back the person at their center. Some leave only a route through town, a taxi journey, a remembered figure in rain, and the patient work of people who kept asking because not asking would have been its own kind of loss. There is no need now to solve what the file itself has not solved. The pages can settle. The old names can rest for the night. Dorking can grow quiet again in your mind, with shop windows dimmed, library shelves still, and the road up toward Box Hill lying under the soft weight of darkness. Somewhere in the case file, Ruth remains 16, paused at the edge of a winter evening, while everyone around her has moved through the years. That is one of the tender sorrows of an unsolved disappearance, and it is also why the careful remembering matters. It gives her more than a final sighting. It gives her patience, attention, and a place held open with respect. The lamp is low now, and the rain in the window is only a sound you can let go of. The file stays open, the hill stays quiet, and for tonight, the unanswered things can rest where they are.